I like to think of we're a $40 billion company, and we are still a startup because we are in a $3 trillion industry. And it's changing. And every time there is change, there is opportunity. We have a great place today. And with all these changes coming, if we do the right things, exciting things can happen.
Welcome to Speaking of Business. I'm Goldie Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. It's finally summer in Canada after a long and difficult few months. As I think back to the many conversations I've had on the podcast this year, I realize one central theme keeps emerging: leaders adapting to change. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the way we live, work, and interact. But that disruption has also spurred creativity and new ways of thinking. And as Canada faces the challenge of rebuilding after the pandemic, change will continue to be key to our recovery. Swamy Kotagiri knows a thing or two about change. As the CEO of Magna International, the self-declared tech geek is focused on developing new solutions to make vehicles safer and cleaner. A global leader in mobility technology, Magna likes to say it's driven people are driving change. So how is the storied Canadian company adapting to change as we look towards a post-pandemic future? Let's find out. Welcome to the podcast, Swamy.
Good afternoon, Goldie, and thank you for having me.
Let's start with that motto, that Magna motto, driven people driving change. What does that mean to you?
The foundation of Magna really has been about, is built on people and the culture of the people. You know, maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I definitely would like to say very fortunate to have one of the most talented teams in the industry. And with the whole slogan of driven people driving change comes from the foundational aspect of the entrepreneurial decentralized culture of Magna, where everybody feels accountable, everybody feels responsible, and everybody is excited to adapt to change and make it an opportunity.
Now that sounds like something you could do if you were a startup. How do you, at the size of Magna, maintain that spirit of innovation?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I've said this often in many public forums. I would like to call Magna as a 60-year-old startup. I can say that because of the long-standing entrepreneurial culture, which is really the bedrock that empowers their employees to develop and to implement new ideas. If you kind of really look at the compensation model, not just at the leadership level at Magna, but at the management of every division, all 350 divisions, they are compensated based on the plan they come up and on the profit and loss, which they live by every day, right? That really brings forward the ownership, the accountability and responsibility really into practice. With that as a background, it helps us to be really agile because you really don't have to go through 10 steps to get, something approved or to make a decision. We have a framework within which we have to operate, obviously, but once you have that framework and you know where you're going, you don't really have to go through a long process to do anything. That's what keeps us going still like a startup, I believe.
Well, it's working. You're doing well, and you're leading in the area of change, something I mentioned in the introduction. In addition to obviously everything going on with the pandemic, the climate change agenda is front and center in your industry. Talk to me about how you view that.
Yeah, like you said, climate change is really the macro driver, and it goes beyond the automotive industry. Everybody has a responsibility in doing their part. And as an automotive industry has looked at it, and the way we are addressing it is the tailpipe emissions, which is very tangible to the people in discussions, but there is more to it. But let's start with how we are doing it. As we look at how the industry addresses climate change and how we are doing our part, the result is electrification of vehicles, right? When we electrify vehicles, we're addressing two things. One, the emissions from the tailpipe and reducing, carbon dioxide and so on. But on the other side, we're also looking at the air quality. right? The particulate matter, material in air, and so on and so forth. So electrification is really a solution to the problem we are trying to address. And if you go beyond that in manufacturing, obviously there's a whole lot of things in terms of recyclability, the footprint of the water usage, the power mix that you have, and it can go a long way upstream and downstream, right? We talk about electric vehicles, but you got to take into account how you mine the minerals that are required to make batteries. What do you
Right.
do with the batteries after their life is done in the vehicle? So it's a much more complex problem than what we usually discuss.
And you don't have an answer to that question even today, and yet you're taking the leap.
No, I think just like any other technology, electrification is at the infancy, I would say, still, right? We have to start, and we know that tailpipe emissions contribute a lot to the problem today. So by addressing that, we have started on the right path. Now comes what I call the secondary and the tertiary issues of how do you optimize the value chain further, right? By using the right mix of energy in the mineral extraction, in making the batteries, and making batteries more efficient by using them for more number of miles with the same life, right? And once they're done, how do you recycle them? I am very optimistic of the next steps that the industry will go through. This is just the beginning and the right beginning.
Where do you see the technology going? I mean, in terms of how it's going to change the way people use their vehicle. You've talked, I think, at Magna, not about autonomous as much as assisted driving vehicles, for example, right? What does the future look like?
The future is really exciting. And when I say that, I always say if there is no change, there is no opportunity, right? And we're really at the crossroads of mobility being looked at from a different perspective, right? There is so many facets to this issue. What we just talked about is what's the impact of the macro issues and how is industry addressing it? That is electrification. We're addressing safety by having additional features that make driving more convenient, more efficient, more safe, and in the long run, even address it with full autonomy by reducing congestion on roads, better usage of the asset, which is your car. There are many facets to this problem. When we look at it today, I would say the four big themes that everybody's talking about. One is, as an industry, electrification, therefore addressing climate change, making the experience safer, more economical, still enjoyable, and that is assisted driving and towards the path of autonomy, and just the general need of people to stay connected as they move from their office or home into a car. They want a seamless transition. That means they still want to be connected, being able to do what they were doing before they got into the car. That is the connectivity piece. And then there is this huge discussion on mobility as a service, not as much as ownership, but a utilitarian function. How do I get from point A to point B in the most efficient, economical, enjoyable way, right? So it changes the perspective of ownership to a service. I would say these are the big themes that the industry is trying to address. And like I said, that's what makes it so exciting to be in this industry right now.
Who is driving that change? Is it a push or a pull here? Or is it because of government policies on climate? Or is there a customer push at the other end? Or does the customer even understand how things are going to change for them as they look forward?
I think it's both, Goldie. If you look at the legislative regulatory requirements that came from an emissions and climate change perspective, it started off as a pull or a push from the regulatory side. But you see different vehicles now, and there is excitement of, sitting in an electric vehicle, the wow factor of, when you put your foot on the pedal and what you get, right? In terms of power and the speed and the quickness and no noise. And just the experience inside, the interiors that is providing. The dashboard is digital. It's completely different experience inside. So what started off as a push by regulation is now starting to become a pull from the consumer side, right? And if the battery costs continue to trend in the right direction, as volumes and take rates increase, it'll become even more a pull, I think, right? And the same thing applies to ADAS and autonomy too. What starts off as a requirement to make driving safe now has become certain factors that are just enjoyable. Once you get used to a highway chauffeur or a traffic jam assist, where you're sitting in a traffic jam at low speed, but you don't have to do anything. It follows the car in front of you, and you're able to be legally distracted, I should say,
Yes.
for a little bit. All this is convenience, and there is a sense of excitement there. So it's a combination of both push and pull.
Now, the key to climate change, many people feel the solutions lie in innovation and really in technology. Obviously, behavior change is a part of that as well. But how is Magna really thinking about the innovation economy? How is Magna making the decisions and where to invest? You're a global company, right? Where to invest those dollars? And let's get specific to why I'm asking, which is how can Canada compete to get that capital allocated here so the innovation can happen here?
I think when you look at a innovation ecosystem, our firm belief has always been you do a lot. There is a rich heritage in Magna of innovation, whether it's process, material, product, even in the culture and the model, as I talked about, of making this enterprise very exciting. Our process has been bottoms up to see where we stand. Our business process is very logical. You start off by looking at the macroeconomics, what's driving. So let's take the example of climate change. Automotive industry's answer to that is electrification. From a Magna perspective, what are the products that are impacted? So we make all-wheel drive, four-wheel drive systems today. So we are going to be making e-drives. It's a very logical flow. Once we say that, we can further break it down. Okay, what does an e-drive have? It has an e-machine or a motor. It has power electronics. It has software. It has the gearbox at a very high level. Mm-hmm. What is the competence we have, and what is the competence that we believe we need to have going forward, right? So we had the overall system knowledge as an example in this case, but we felt in the long run, you need to have the manufacturing excellence in making motors and inverters. So that became a problem statement. So how do we fill that gap? To have the right economies of scale, with the right expertise, the right vertical integration proportion, and we ended up doing a joint venture with LG, right? So that's one path to address a gap. And that applies to everything. We look at autonomous driving and we say we need to have our portfolio with the right sensors. We need to have the right compute. We need to have the right talent in the software and hardware. And we take multiple paths. Some of it is just a rigorous process of innovation inside the four walls. The other is actually approaching the universities, the research institutions, and the startup ecosystem, where we can go and explain to them, this is what the industry is looking. What solutions do you have that might be interesting? And the symbiotic relationship is they bring the idea, they bring the fundamental science, the tech, or the concept. We can take that and find the right application. We can bring the rigor and the validation, the production scale that is required to think through all of that. And sometimes we invest in them. Sometimes we work on a proof of concept with them. Sometimes it's an acquisition. Sometimes it's an alliance of some kind. So, the entire spectrum of possibilities, right? Now, coming to your question on Canada, I think you and I talked a little bit on other forums on the DARPA model, right? The public-private partnership is extremely important. How do we define a problem that exists today somewhere, right? And now if you go looking for that, there is a very high probability to get an answer first, right? And it also provides the encouragement for somebody who's in the academia or other places to say, now I see the application where I could put this in use. I think that dialogue and communication is extremely important. And any initiative in policy perspective, as in governments or universities or research institutions think about how to bring this together, that'll be helpful.
Right.
Now, we talked a little bit about the richness of the mineral resources in Canada. How do we leverage that? We have the hydropower, the clean power. If we can go through the value stream and say if electrification is a big trend, how do we play a role in the battery, the manufacturing of the cells, the integration of the cells into battery packs? If you can show a value proposition from the overall energy equation, Canada could definitely differentiate, right? And again, like I said, it's a stage of infancy still. So it's not that there is a lot of supply. Imagine if even 30-40% of the industry gets electrified by 2030, we're talking 30-40 million vehicles, right? And that capacity is nowhere near existing right now. So untapped potential, huge opportunity in so many ways. We can even become the pioneers in looking at providing the right infrastructure from charging, right, on highways for commercial transportation of vehicles. Providing all of this, I think there is a fantastic time to take a leadership position.
You mentioned the DARPA model for our listeners, effectively, the program that said, let's put men on the moon and
Yes.
made it happen. And, it's interesting. You and I both come from the same state in India. I came to Canada. You came to America. I look at our country and say, we've had it pretty easy. We've had it pretty good. You look at where you are, they never settle. The ambition, the drive, the determination just seems to get higher and higher and higher. Obviously, as a superpower, it's a little easier to do. What can we learn from you? And what are you seeing now that you're running a global company headquartered in Canada?
Goldie, I think there's a couple of things that you mentioned which are really important for the success, irrespective of whether it's a organization or an individual or a country or a society, is not to have a sense of complacency. I think once the complacency sets in or comfort sets in, I believe that's the beginning of the end. We always talk about a few examples in our groups here, as we say, it's like any sporting event. And how do you know you've done your best? I used to be somewhat of an enthusiast in track and field. And when you make a run and at the finish line, if you don't fall off, you haven't given it your full, right? And I also say, when you're jumping, once in a while, you got to sprain your ankle or break your leg. Make sure you don't die because you have to live for the next day. But only then you pushed your limit, right? Getting comfortable with the butterflies in the stomach always, and recognizing that, complacency sets in and leads to boredom and leads to too many negative things, right? I see that's the difference I go to Silicon Valley. I'll tell you, I always feel everybody gets up every day and comes out with the feeling, I'm going to change the world today. I cannot put my finger on whether it's an individual, whether it's the ecosystem, whether it's the university. There is something. And there are groups of this and clusters of this happening all around the world. Don't get me wrong, right? You go to University of Toronto and talk AI, I get the same feeling. Mm-hmm. You get to the University of Waterloo and you see the startup ecosystem there. It's phenomenal, right? So it exists everywhere. So what I'm trying to say is the main characteristic is that hunger and drive. It's got to stay burning all the time. I think that's the secret. Nothing more magical than that.
Well said. I couldn't agree with you more. And, in some ways, COVID really is a seminal moment in how countries emerge from this and how they're going to be able to compete. Now, the other thing that's happened through COVID, and I think relates to our conversation, is some jobs are going to disappear. Not all the jobs are going to be there when the economy fully opens up. And in some cases, the changes that you're making may result in jobs changing, which of course means there's a responsibility that not only governments have, but private sector has when it comes to skills and reskilling our workforce. Talk to me about what Magna's view is on that and what you're planning on doing to help people with skills.
That's one of the things that really excites me in the company In most of the plants, actually, 2 or 3 plants in a region get together and have an apprenticeship program. They say, this is what we're doing as a process today. This is what we think we're going to see in the next 3 to 4 years. And they actually learn on the job. They have separated spaces where you can go learn mechatronics, where you can go learn robotic programming. As we start an initiative looking at data and what does this data tell us today, in a bigger picture is data analytics, right? The Industry 4.0. The best way we feel is by starting a specific initiative and a project. And as it grows, the people who are participating in the project are teaching others, right? That has been the best way for us to expand, proliferate the skill. Obviously, we get the experts from the outside to start off and seed the initiative, but this way we don't have to worry about the aspect of teaching the Magna culture, right? These are people inside. And it also creates an excitement within that. Look, it's not just the job that I'm doing today, it's what else can I do? What got me into Magna is really the entrepreneurial spirit and the freedom that if you have an idea and if you're willing to accept the responsibility, you can go do it. That in combination with the ability to learn a different skill, go do something else, I think is what keeps us going. Recently, we started a virtual learning platform where the subject matter experts teach 10 or 15 minutes at a time, maybe 10 sessions on quality, design for manufacturing, program management, different topics, right? You can just go on and at your leisure, continue to expand your skill. I think that is the next way of learning, not anymore in just the classrooms. And you can see our kids, right? They learn a whole lot from YouTube than I ever could learn in a classroom.
Yeah, well, they can certainly solve problems pretty quickly these days looking at it on YouTube. The pandemic, as I said, has had impact on this issue as well. And I'm wondering, as you look back at what we hope is a turning point now, we were just talking before coming on air about the summer. There's a sense of, we're going to be moving past this. Are there things that you did at Magna, changes that you made at Magna during the pandemic that you think will outlast the pandemic?
By necessity, we had to look at restructuring actions, right? So it is at a different cost base. And like I think you started off by saying the way we interact, the way we live, the way we go to work, all of it has changed. Some of it for sure is going to be lasting beyond the pandemic. For example, the digital and the virtual tools that we have all gotten familiar with and have been forced to use, I think we're learning the merits of it. So the essential travel versus non-essential travel and how can we interact in the virtual world. Travel needs, remote work policy, all of these things are definitely going to outlast the pandemic and will become a part or a way of, call it the new normal, right? The normalcy comes back, but it's going to look a little bit different. Mm-hmm. But that's part of life. Change and we adapt, look on the positive side.
Speaking of change, I mean, you took over during the pandemic from Don Walker, who was, of course, was there for over a decade as a CEO, and both of you have been with Magna for a very long time. How do you bring about change? Because anytime there's leadership change happens in terms of the culture that you're trying to create. And you've had to do it during a pandemic. And as you said, perhaps the world we're going back to is not this world we were in. So it may become even harder to create that culture. I certainly hear that a lot from CEOs. But how are you thinking about the importance of Magna culture? Because we started there with the model.
I think the key thing, right? Like I've been in Magna at the table with Don. Don's been over 2 decades, right? And I've had the chance to work with Don for very closely for at least 8 years. And during the pandemic, he kind of asked me to lead, and I was leading the activities on a everyday basis. Different work streams, shutting down, reopen, started with China, did the same thing in Europe, North America later, the Smart Start playbook. And, even the transition of my role happened virtually. Yeah. Right? I give a lot of credit to the management team. The management team that we have in place around the table is the same, right? So that stability and the sense of familiarity made it easy in a way for me to go through the transition. And it was done extremely well in the planning process, right? And I still can pick up the phone and call Don if I have to. But I think those are the two things. And like I said, the underlying aspect of all of this is the accountability and responsibility that exists at all levels of Magna. I think that is what gives us the foundational strength. From a cultural aspect, definitely would like to keep that, right? Now, the world's changing, and we have been talking about a strategy and how do we position Magna. Luckily, a lot of the products that we have today are really agnostic to some of the changes. As an example, whether it's an ICE-driven vehicle or an electric vehicle, you're going to have seats and body and chassis and so on and so forth, right? And some of the areas like powertrain and, ADAS-related topics, we are expanding and have been continuing over the years. And we recently talked about our long-term strategy. We're going to accelerate capital deployment in high-growth areas. We're going to continue to remain focused on operational excellence by looking at machine learning, the smart factory of the future, and so on and so forth. And then because of the broad portfolio that Magna has, including the ability to design and manufacture full vehicles, we can unlock a lot of potential as the new startups and new entrants are coming into the mobility ecosystem, right? So it's using the foundation that we have, but unlock future potential. That's where my focus is.
Normally, consultants types folks will ask CEOs, what's keeping you up at night? I'm going to spare you that question. I want to conclude by really just looking forward and asking you, what are you the most optimistic about?
The way I look at it, Goldie, it's a good question. I like to think of we're a $40 billion company. We are still a startup because we are in a $3 trillion industry, and it's changing. And every time there is change, there is opportunity. We have a great place today. And with all these changes coming, if we do the right things, exciting things can happen. That's what's exciting for me, right? And I hope to leave a legacy like Don did. There's a rich heritage of 60 years. So if I do the right things, somebody from 60 years from now will be talking about it.
It'll be their turn to take over the startup.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for doing this, Swamy. It's great to have an opportunity to get some insights from you. I think the listeners would have learned quite a bit. And thanks for your leadership. It's at a critical time. We appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Goldie. Thanks for having me anytime.
Swamy Kotagiri is the CEO of Magna International. And that's a wrap for the Speaking of Business podcast for the season. As we head into what we all hope will be a summer of fewer case counts and greater freedoms, I want to thank you for joining me as we have journeyed through the challenges of the pandemic. If you missed any of our inspiring and thoughtful conversations with innovators, leaders, and entrepreneurs this year, I hope you'll take the time over the next few months to listen to them. If you like what you hear, make sure you subscribe so you can listen to many more episodes when we resume again in September. Just search for Speaking of Business wherever you get your podcasts, or simply go to our website at thebusinesscouncil.ca. Until next time, I'm Goldie Hyder. Thanks for joining us.